In the summer of 1944, the central sector of the Eastern Front looked static on the map, but unstable in reality. For nearly a year after the Battle of Kursk, German Army Group Center had been pushed back to a line running through Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, yet it still formed the hinge linking German forces in the Baltic to those in Ukraine. Behind that front lay the railway corridors through Molodechno and Minsk toward Vilnius, Warsaw, and East Prussia, routes that supplied the German 3rd Panzer Army and connected Army Group Center to the rest of the Eastern Theater. For the Soviet leadership, this central belt of Belarus had both military and political significance. Militarily, Stavka saw the destruction of Army Group Center as the key to opening a direct path to the Vistula and, ultimately, to Berlin. Politically, the liberation of the Belarusian SSR, occupied since 1941, was framed as a necessary step toward restoring Soviet authority in Eastern Europe. In planning for what became Operation Bagration, Soviet commanders committed roughly 1,670,000 personnel, more than 3,800 tanks, and almost 33,000 artillery pieces across 4 fronts. Facing them, Army Group Center disposed of about 486,000 combat troops, around 849,000, including rear services, fewer than 500 operational tanks and assault guns, and just over 3,200 field guns. Within that broad plan, the 3rd Belarusian Front, created from the former Western Front on the 24th of April 1944 and commanded by General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, was assigned the northern half of the main blow. Its order of battle for the opening phase included 5th Army, 39th Army, 11th Guards Army, and 31st Army, supported by 5th Guards Tank Army and 1st Air Army. In the Vitebsk-Orsha sector alone, Soviet forces committed about 359,000 troops against roughly 165,000 men of the German 3rd Panzer Army and the northern wing of 4th Army. The 39th and 5th Armies formed the left or northern wing of Chernyakhovsky's front. Their task was not simply to break the German line east of Vitebsk, but to turn that breach into a corridor running westward through the forests and lakes toward Lepel, Seno, and ultimately the Molodechno rail junction north of Minsk. Soviet planning documents and later analyses describe this axis as one of the main directions for a subsequent cavalry mechanized group, and later for deep exploitation toward Molodechno, bypassing Minsk from the north and threatening German escape routes from the capital. German intentions were shaped by different calculations. Army Group Center's command in Minsk considered the central Belarus front vital for holding the line in front of East Prussia and for covering the Warsaw-Minsk rail link. But the Oberkommando des Heers and Hitler himself expected the main Soviet summer offensive to fall further south, in Ukraine, and repeatedly diverted armoured reserves away from Army Group Center. By June 1944, the Central Front had only a handful of mobile units in reserve, and many infantry divisions were under strength. The 3rd Panzer Army, defending the Vitebsk and Vileyka approaches, was a panzer army largely in name, with predominantly infantry divisions arranged in several defensive belts east of the Dvina and on the roads leading toward Lepel and Molodechno. Behind the German lines, occupied Belarus had become one of the most active partisan regions in Europe. By mid-1944, Soviet and Allied partisan formations in Belarus numbered on the order of hundreds of thousands of fighters. One synthesis estimates around 270,000 partisans, tying down about 15% of Army Group Center's strength in security operations, railguard duty, and anti-partisan sweeps. In Vileyka and the surrounding districts, partisan detachments sabotaged bridges, rail lines, and telephone cables, and maintained clandestine contacts with local civilians and with Soviet liaison officers. Their role in destroying or blocking rail traffic was built directly into the operational plan of Bagration, as a way to slow German reinforcement and withdrawal once the front was broken. For civilians in the Vileyka-Molodechno region, these preconditions meant living between two systems of control. German occupation authorities imposed requisitions of grain and livestock, organized forced labor deportations, and conducted periodic sweeps against suspected partisan sympathizers. At the same time, partisan units demanded food, shelter, and information, and sometimes carried out attacks that provoked German reprisals. By June 1944, many villages in northern Belarus had already experienced destruction once or more, and the prospect of a major Soviet offensive aroused both hope for liberation and fear of renewed fighting. Thus, on the eve of 23 June 1944, the future Vileyka offensive sector, stretching westward from the battlefield around Vitebsk toward the line of Vileyka and Molodechno, was more than a map segment between better-known battles at Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk. For Soviet planners, it was the intended path for a northern arm of encirclement, aimed at cutting German communications north of Minsk. For German commanders, it was a flank they believed could be held with existing infantry formations and a thin mobile reserve. For the local population, it was a landscape already militarized by 3 years of occupation and partisan war. The decisions taken in this relatively narrow corridor would, over the next 4 days, help determine whether Army Group Centre could withdraw in time, or whether its route west would be severed in depth, contributing directly to the encirclement around Minsk that followed. At dawn on 23rd of June 1944, the quiet along the central Belarus front ended with a synchronized artillery preparation. On the sector assigned to the 3rd Belarusian Front, batteries of 122mm and 152mm howitzers, Katyusha rocket launchers, and regimental guns opened fire across a frontage of several dozen kilometers. In the strip earmarked for the future advance toward Vileyka and Molodechno, 39th Army and 5th Army concentrated their fire on German forward trenches, command posts, and suspected artillery positions, using firing tables refined by weeks of reconnaissance and registration shots disguised as routine activity. The command structure behind this opening phase reflected the Soviet preference for centralized planning and tightly coordinated time schedules. At the top, the Stavka directive for Operation Bagration specified H-hour for the ground assault on different fronts, with 3rd Belarusian Front beginning its main infantry attack on 23 June, after a preliminary phase of air and artillery strikes. General Ivan Chernyakhovsky received a clear mission: break the German defense on the Vitebsk-Orsha line and open the way west for mobile exploitation. Within his headquarters, separate operational groups oversaw the left-wing formations, including the 39th Army and the 5th Army, which were to pivot the front toward the northwest once initial objectives were taken. On the ground, 39th Army assembled rifle corps opposite the positions of German divisions deployed north and northwest of Vitebsk. These Soviet corps typically fielded 3 rifle divisions each, with individual divisions averaging between 6,000 and 8,000 combat-effective personnel after prior fighting. Reinforced anti-tank regiments, sapper battalions, and attached tank regiments with T-34s and self-propelled guns formed assault groups tasked with opening breaches at selected points. To their south, 5th Army lined up in depth, prepared to join the offensive once the front began to bend westward, and corridors for further advance emerged. Facing them, the German 3rd Panzer Army relied on a chain of infantry divisions supported by limited armoured reserves and a network of field fortifications. Forward strongpoints consisted of trench systems, dugouts, and machine gun nests built over months, backed by minefields and anti-tank obstacles on the likely approaches. The German command structure concentrated decision-making at army and corps level. General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding 3rd Panzer Army, coordinated several corps headquarters responsible for sectors where divisions such as the 252nd, 81st, and 197th Infantry Divisions held the line. These divisions, often below nominal strength, had to defend wide frontages with relatively thin reserves. The Luftwaffe and the Red Army Air Force also played roles in the opening phase. Soviet air units assigned to 1st Air Army flew pre-dawn and early morning sorties against German rail hubs, bridges and road junctions behind the Vitebsk and Lapel sectors, aiming to disrupt reinforcement and resupply. Fighter-bomber regiments, equipped with Il-2s and P-2s, attacked artillery positions and headquarters identified by reconnaissance flights and partisan reports. German fighter groups attempted to intercept, but fuel limitations, airfield vulnerability, and earlier transfers of air units to other theatres reduced their ability to contest every strike. The initial Soviet movements were carefully staged. Reconnaissance and force operations had already probed the German front in previous days, mapping firing points and identifying weak spots. On 23rd June, assault battalions of 39th Army advanced behind creeping barrages, using smoke and local engineers to clear lanes through wire and mines. In some sectors, small groups infiltrated close to German trenches during the night, sheltering in shell holes or drainage ditches to shorten the distance to the first defensive line when the artillery lifted. German reactions in the first hours combined local initiative with rigid higher-level directives. Company and battalion commanders organised counterfire with available mortars and guns and called for artillery support on pre-registered Soviet assembly areas. At the same time, higher headquarters, adhering to instructions not to abandon prepared positions without explicit orders, insisted on holding the first line as long as possible. Requests to pull back to second lines of defence or to commit the few available armoured reserves were filtered through several echelons, slowing response times as the Soviet barrage shifted deeper. Between the organised military structures, Soviet partisans and local civilians also reacted to the opening phase. Partisan detachments in the forests around Lepel and Vileyka received coded signals indicating the start of Bagration and intensified attacks on rail lines and roads, placing demolition charges on bridges and culverts. Civilians in villages near the front experienced the artillery preparation as a sustained shock. Many sought shelter in cellars or dugouts, unsure whether the fighting would pass quickly or turn their area into a prolonged battlefield. By the evening of the 23rd of June, the first day of the offensive had altered the balance of control along the front, but had not yet clarified the future shape of the Vileyka axis. Soviet reports indicated penetrations of several kilometres in selected sectors held by 3rd Panzer Army, while German situation maps showed local retreats and the gradual isolation of some forward battalions. The core structures of both sides remained intact. Soviet Rifle Corps continued to press forward according to plan, and German Corps headquarters attempted to restore coherence and seal gaps. Within this evolving front line, the left wing of 3rd Belarusian Front, anchored on 39th Army and 5th Army, was beginning the sequence of movements that would turn a local breach into a route of advance toward Vileyka and Molodechno. Strategic planning for the Vileyka axis developed within the broader framework of Operation Bagration, but had its own clearly defined objectives. For 3rd Belarusian Front, the left wing built on 39th Army and 5th Army was expected not only to participate in the destruction of German forces in the Vitebsk salient, but to turn any local success into a deep advance toward Lepel, Vileyka, and Molodechno. Molodechno, a rail junction linking Minsk with Vilnius, Polotsk, and Lida, was identified as a key node. If captured or threatened from the east and northeast, it would disrupt the withdrawal and resupply routes for Army Group Center and complicate any attempt to form a new defensive line west of Minsk. Soviet planning documents translated these aims into phased operational goals. In the first phase, 39th Army would assist in breaking the German front north and northwest of Vitebsk, compressing or eliminating German forces east of the western Dvina. The second phase envisaged a rapid westward shift, with 39th Army and elements of 5th Army advancing along the road network toward Lepel and further to Vileyka. A mobile exploitation group, including tank and mechanized units, was earmarked to pass through any breach and advance 80 to 120 kilometers into the German rear, with the intention of reaching the Molodechno area, while the main encirclement battles around Orsha and Mogilev were still unfolding. To achieve this, Soviet planners concentrated firepower and engineering resources on carefully chosen breakthrough sectors. Along the main assault strips, artillery density could reach more than 150 guns and mortars per kilometer of front, combining divisional artillery, corps-level howitzers, and army-level heavy guns. Katyusha rocket regiments were positioned to strike second-line positions and crossroads rather than just the first trench line, a choice intended to disrupt German reserves at the moment they were committed. Engineer battalions received bridging equipment, assault boats, and mine-clearing gear, reflecting expectations that even after the initial German positions were broken, further water obstacles and field fortifications would have to be negotiated quickly to maintain momentum. Logistics planning for the Vileyka direction took into account both the terrain and the state of Soviet supply networks. The forests and lakes north of the main Moscow-Minsk highway limited large-scale movement to several key east-west roads and forest tracks. To support a rapid advance, front headquarters arranged for fuel and ammunition dumps to be established close to the start line, with truck columns assigned to specific armies and corps. Railway troops prepared to repair and convert captured rail lines to Soviet gauge as soon as sectors were cleared, with particular emphasis on routes leading toward Lepel and further west. The presence of numerous rivers and marshy lowlands required additional pontoon parks and road-building units to ensure that heavy equipment could follow the rifle divisions. German planning in the same area reflected a different set of assumptions. 3rd Panzer Army and Army Group Center expected Soviet pressure along the Vitebsk sector, but assessed that the main Soviet effort would likely fall elsewhere, particularly in Ukraine or against Army Group North. The Vileyka-Molodechno region was regarded as rearward, important as a communication zone, but not as an immediate battlefield. Defensive preparations concentrated on holding the existing forward line, with a combination of field fortifications, mine belts, and a limited number of strongpoints. Depth positions were sketched, but often incomplete, and plans for organized withdrawal routes toward Vileyka and Molodechno were not given the same priority as the defense of fixed points such as Vitebsk. German logistics and supply planning for this sector depended heavily on the east-west railway axis running through Molodechno and Minsk, and on a secondary network of roads that were vulnerable to partisan attacks. Fuel and ammunition stocks were limited by broader shortages affecting the Eastern Front, and motor transport units had to support both frontline resupply and anti-partisan operations in the rear. The doctrine of holding fortified localities as fortresses restricted flexibility. Divisions were expected to defend prepared positions for as long as possible, rather than trading space for time in a controlled withdrawal that could have preserved formations for later use around Minsk. Intelligence and counterintelligence shaped these plans in different ways on each side. Soviet staff work combined aerial photography, prisoner interrogations, and reports from partisan detachments to map German positions, artillery batteries, and supply routes. Maskirovka measures concealed the concentration of Soviet forces, including dummy artillery positions, radio deception, and the transfer of formations at night. German intelligence detected signs of increased Soviet activity, but underestimated the scale and depth of the planned offensive. Reports warning of strong Soviet concentrations in the 3rd Belarusian front sector did not always translate into reinforcements or changes in operational doctrine. Propaganda and political work framed these preparations for both military personnel and civilians. Soviet front and army political departments emphasized the liberation of Belarus and the destruction of German forces that had occupied the region since 1941. linking the operation to earlier defeats suffered in the first year of the war. German information services, addressing both frontline soldiers and the home population, stressed the necessity of holding the Eastern Front to protect the Reich's eastern provinces and insisted that new defensive positions would stabilize the situation. In the Vileyka-Molodechno corridor, these messages intersected with the daily experience of a rear area that was already militarized and contested, setting the stage for how both sides would interpret the rapid changes that followed once the planned offensive moved beyond the initial breach and began to unfold in depth. The first full day of ground fighting along the future Vileyka axis unfolded in a series of localized clashes that gradually merged into a broader breach. On the northern part of 3rd Belarusian Front's sector, rifle divisions of 39th Army advanced behind the rolling artillery fire and entered German forward positions that had been mapped in detail during the preparatory phase. In some places, the first trench line was found largely abandoned, with only small groups of riflemen and machine gun crews remaining. In others, German platoons held on and forced Soviet assault groups into short-range fights with grenades and submachine guns before withdrawing toward prepared second lines. The character of the terrain shaped these first engagements. Wooded belts and small rivers cut across the Soviet advance routes, creating alternating zones of visibility and concealment. Soviet infantry moved in company or battalion columns along narrow cleared paths, while supporting T-34s and self-propelled guns were restricted to firmer ground and road embankments. Where the artillery preparation had cut telephone lines and damaged dugouts, German battalion and regimental headquarters had difficulty coordinating fire support. Some batteries continued to fire pre-planned defensive barrages, while others had to reposition after being spotted by Soviet observers and attacked by counter-battery fire or ground attack aircraft. On the adjacent sector, 5th Army's formations initially advanced more slowly, as they joined the offensive after the main breach had begun to appear. Their rifle corps were committed in depth, directed to move through gaps opened by neighbouring units rather than frontal assaults against intact strongpoints. This created a pattern in which some German positions found themselves bypassed and threatened from the flanks or rear, while others still faced frontal pressure. The result was an increasingly irregular line in which small German groups held isolated localities as Soviet units pushed past them toward road crossings and villages of tactical significance. Territorial changes during these first engagements were measured in kilometers rather than tens of kilometers, but they had cumulative effects. By the end of 23rd June and into 24th June, Soviet reports from the 39th Army sector recorded the capture of several villages that had served as intermediate supply points for German infantry regiments, along with road junctions that linked the front to the rear area around Leipol. German situation summaries noted that individual battalions had been reduced in strength and compelled to fall back to improvised positions, sometimes without clear coordination with neighbouring units, creating seams in the defensive system. For civilians living near the fighting, these early shifts were immediately visible. In villages close to the old front line, German field units withdrew or were overrun, leaving behind damaged equipment, scattered stores, and occasional wounded personnel who could not be evacuated in time. Local residents faced rapid transitions. In some places, Soviet soldiers appeared only hours after German troops had departed. In others, fighting passed through more than once as counterattacks attempted to retake lost ground. Further west, in towns designated as rear area hubs, German administrative officers began burning records, destroying telephone exchanges, and preparing to remove personnel and transport that might be needed for later stages of the campaign. Morale reacted differently on each side. Many Soviet infantrymen, after earlier defensive campaigns, interpreted the initial advances and the capture of trench systems that had resisted for months as confirmation that the offensive plan was working. Political officers emphasized the speed of progress and linked local gains to the wider goal of collapsing Army Group Center. At the same time, The cost of taking fortified positions, particularly where German machine gun nests and mortars were left intact, reminded units that the operation would not consist solely of rapid marches. Medical stations behind the front received a constant flow of wounded during the first 2 days. Among German troops, the combination of extensive artillery fire, air attacks, and loss of communications produced uncertainty about the scale of the Soviet effort. Some frontline companies believed they were facing local assaults, similar to earlier probes, and expected orders to counterattack once the shelling subsided. Others, especially in sectors where Soviet rifle units had already reached second-line positions or cut minor roads, began to report that the situation was no longer under control at regimental level. Field police units and staff officers attempted to regulate traffic and prevent premature withdrawal of rear services, but congestion on roads leading west indicated that the front was starting to lose its cohesion. An early turning point in these initial engagements came when Soviet forces on the left wing managed to link separate penetrations into a single continuous bulge, pushing into the area between several German divisions. This did not yet amount to a full operational breakthrough, but it undermined the ability of 3rd Panzer Army to shift reserves laterally across the threatened zone. Routes that had been intended for reinforcing Vitebsk or stabilizing intermediate positions now ran close to or through areas under Soviet artillery observation. These first changes in the geometry of the front laid the groundwork for the next phase, when the fighting would expand from contested trench lines into a struggle over the deeper road and rail network leading toward Lepel, Vileyka, and Molodechno. By 24th of June, the localized breaches along the northern wing of 3rd Belarusian Front developed into an expanding zone of instability. Soviet corps commanders in 39th Army reported that several German battalions had lost coherent trench systems and were falling back in segments, leaving intervals of open ground between strong points. Headquarters responded by ordering a general widening of the assault front. Additional rifle regiments were committed, and artillery fire was shifted deeper onto crossroads and forest edges where German reserves might assemble. What had begun as carefully defined breakthrough sectors now evolved into a broader push aimed at unraveling the German line between the Vitebsk area and the approaches to Lepel. This expansion brought new challenges in command and control. Soviet forward observers and battalion headquarters often advanced more quickly than their wired communications could follow, relying on radio sets that were vulnerable to interference and battery shortages. Some units moved beyond the range of their pre-planned artillery schedules and had to wait for guns to be brought forward along damaged roads. Truck convoys, horse-drawn supply columns, and medical evacuation carts shared the same narrow routes, creating congestion that slowed the delivery of ammunition and fuel. Staff officers at Army and Corps level had to adjust timetables on short notice, reassigning artillery support and diverting columns around demolished bridges or villages still contested by German rearguards. German forces in the threatened sector faced an escalating crisis under these conditions. 3rd Panzer Army's Corps headquarters attempted to restore a continuous front by pulling back regiments to intermediate lines marked on earlier maps. But some of these positions existed only on paper. As Soviet rifle units reached road junctions and small river crossings earlier than anticipated, planned defensive lines were compromised before they could be fully manned. Reserve companies and anti-tank detachments were thrown into action piecemeal, often meeting Soviet assault groups already supported by attached tanks and self-propelled guns. Reports from divisions holding the northern part of the front described infantry companies reduced by combat and desertion, with remnants forced into improvised hedgehog positions around villages and forest clearings. Reinforcement movements reflected the tension between local needs and overall strategy. From the perspective of Army Group Center headquarters, the entire front from Vitebsk to Bobruisk required additional reserves, and decisions about where to send the few available mobile units involved trade-offs. When elements of panzer or assault gun battalions were directed toward the Vitebsk pocket or the Orsha sector, less remained for counterattacks in the corridor, now opening toward Lepel and Vileyka. Conversely, attempts by 3rd Panzer Army to retain armoured reserves for its own use could conflict with directives from higher command to prioritise designated fortress cities. These competing demands slow the concentration of effective blocking forces on the northern axis, even as Soviet pressure increased. Casualties on both sides rose as the fighting shifted from trench assaults to engagements around villages, river lines, and crossroads. Soviet regiments that had advanced several kilometers in the first days of the operation now faced pockets of German resistance using prepared cellars, stone buildings, and wooded high ground as strong points. Clearing these positions required repeated infantry attacks, often supported by direct fire guns at short range. German units defending such localities suffered from dwindling ammunition and limited medical support, but their resistance delayed Soviet columns and imposed additional losses. Aid posts behind the lines worked continuously, treating wounded from artillery fragments, small arms fire, and mines laid during hasty retreats. The civilian environment became more deeply entangled in this phase. In villages on the routes toward Lepel and Vileyka, German authorities accelerated evacuations of administrative personnel and transport assets, requisitioning horses and vehicles, and sometimes compelling local inhabitants to move westward as temporary labour or to clear roads. Soviet shells and air attacks aimed at disrupting German movement occasionally struck settlements used for billeting or storage. At the same time, partisan detachments intensified their actions, mining roads, demolishing culverts, and ambushing small German columns attempting to withdraw or bring up supplies. For local residents, the combination of regular troops, partisan forces, and retreating units created overlapping zones of authority and uncertainty, with control changing hands multiple times within a short period. Political and informational structures responded to the crisis with their own instruments. Soviet front newspapers and radio broadcasts highlighted the continuing advance and the liberation of specific towns, linking them to the broader narrative of reclaiming Belarus. Political officers in the 39th and 5th Armies used these reports to maintain morale among troops experiencing heavy fighting and logistical strain. On the German side, field propaganda units emphasized orders to hold key points and portrayed Soviet successes as limited penetrations that would be contained once reinforcements arrived. However, discrepancies between official messages and the realities witnessed by soldiers on threatened sectors, abandoned positions, congested roads, and the visible approach of Soviet formations contributed to growing doubts at company and battalion level. By the evening of 25th June, the escalation had produced a pattern characteristic of crises in deep operations. Soviet maps showed a bulging wedge pushing into the German rear area between several divisions of 3rd Panzer Army, with forward elements approaching road systems that led toward Lepel and beyond. German maps, in contrast, were increasingly marked by arrows representing withdrawals, broken lines where contact with neighbouring units had been lost, and question marks over the locations of regiments that had been ordered to fall back but had not yet reported their new positions. The front was no longer a linear boundary. It had become a series of overlapping fields of movement in which both sides struggled to impose order before the next phase of the offensive unfolded. Between 25th and 26th June, the fighting on the northern wing of 3rd Belarusian Front reached its most intense phase. What had been a series of breaches in the German line developed into a deepening salient extending tens of kilometers into the rear of 3rd Panzer Army. By 26th June, Soviet operational summaries described a penetration approximately 30 kilometers deep and about 90 kilometers wide on this sector, with forward elements of 39th Army approaching the Western Dvina from the south and 5th Army beginning to feed formations into the expanding corridor. The peak of the campaign here was defined by the commitment of mobile reserves. To transform the breach into an operational breakthrough, Front headquarters started bringing forward a cavalry mechanized group tasked with driving toward the Berezina. In Fifth Army's sector, mechanized brigades and cavalry corps were positioned on the shoulders of the penetration, ready to move once rifle divisions had secured crossing points and road junctions. This concentration of mobility was intended to push beyond the immediate German tactical zone and strike at communications serving the Lepel and Vileyka areas, cutting the routes that connected Army Group Center's northern formations to Minsk. On the German side, the same period marked the maximum effort to restore control. 3rd Panzer Army Headquarters ordered counterattacks by available armoured and assault gun units wherever Soviet spearheads appeared most exposed. Small groups of tanks, sometimes fewer than a dozen vehicles, were committed along forest roads to hit advancing Soviet regiments at the moment they emerged from wooded areas or completed river crossings. Infantry battalions were reorganized from mixed remnants of several companies, with platoons drawn from different regiments to create improvised blocking groups. These formations attempted to establish new lines along natural obstacles and road embankments, but often faced Soviet forces that already had artillery support and newly established bridgeheads. The struggle for crossings became a central feature of the peak phase. In the northern part of the sector, Soviet assault detachments pressed toward bridges and fords on tributaries leading to the Dvina, using sappers with assault boats and pontoon sections to create alternate routes if intact crossings could not be seized. German rearguards blew bridges as Soviet vanguards approached, forcing delays while engineers worked under fire to restore at least single-lane passage for infantry and light vehicles. Some crossings changed hands more than once. German counterattacks drove Soviet pioneers from partially repaired structures, only for renewed artillery preparation and fresh infantry companies to retake the sites hours later. Air power reinforced the intensity of these engagements. Soviet ground attack aircraft concentrated on road junctions west of the breakthrough, striking columns of German vehicles and horse-drawn carts attempting to move toward or away from the front. Pilots reported attacks on convoys several kilometers long, composed of mixed military and administrative transport. German fighter units operating with limited fuel and airfield infrastructure focused on covering specific sectors and occasionally intercepted Soviet formations, but could not provide continuous protection. For troops on the ground, the alternation of artillery barrages, bombing runs, and close-range infantry combat created a continuous pressure that compressed events into long, indistinct periods of movement and fighting. Within Soviet formations, this peak period stressed the logistical system. Rifle divisions that had advanced 15 to 20 kilometers since the start of the operation now required sustained deliveries of ammunition, food, and medical supplies over roads damaged by shelling and heavy traffic. Fuel consumption rose sharply as mechanized units entered the corridor. Supply battalions had to improvise routes around destroyed bridges and craters, sometimes unloading trucks and transferring loads to horse-drawn carts, or even to hand-carried packs for the final kilometers. Medical services expanded reception points in villages and improvised collection stations near the front, where wounded soldiers were stabilized before being moved to rear hospitals. German command and control structures were similarly strained. As Soviet forces deepened their penetration, the distances between forward units and army headquarters increased, while telephone lines were cut and radio networks overloaded. Corps staffs attempted to coordinate withdrawals of artillery and heavy weapons to avoid encirclement, but rapidly changing front lines made routes uncertain. Orders issued to hold particular localities sometimes arrived after those positions had already been abandoned or overrun. In other cases, units that were ordered to pull back found their designated routes already blocked by Soviet columns or interdicted by partisan attacks. For civilians in the path of this peak phase, the experience combined rapid change with high risk. Villages that had lain in the German rear only days earlier now found themselves on contested ground or in Soviet-controlled zones. Some residents attempted to remain in place, sheltering in cellars while waiting to see which forces would finally control the area. Others joined columns of German administrative personnel moving west, either compelled by orders or hoping to avoid being caught between retreating troops and advancing formations. Partisan units used the confusion to strengthen their own positions, recruiting new members, seizing abandoned stores, and extending control over forested areas that German forces no longer had the manpower to patrol. By the close of 26th June, the geometry of the front had been transformed. The Soviet wedge on the northern part of 3rd Belarusian Front's sector had reached sufficient depth that its leading elements were oriented not toward the original Vitebsk positions, but toward the interior of Army Group Center's communications network. German divisions on the shoulders of the penetration were increasingly forced to choose between maintaining contact with neighboring formations and avoiding encirclement. While the names Lapel, Vileyka, and Molodechno did not yet appear as liberated points in communiques, the outcome of these intense days of fighting determined how and when those places would be reached in the subsequent phase of the campaign, and how tightly the encirclement east of Minsk could be drawn. As the penetration on the northern wing widened after June 26th, both sides shifted from executing initial plans to improvising under pressure. For Soviet commands in the 39th and 5th Armies, the main task was to preserve the momentum of the advance while preventing their own spearheads from becoming overextended. Rifle divisions that had reached the limit of their endurance were temporarily taken out of the front line when possible, their sectors handed over to fresher units or to second-echelon regiments. Commanders redistributed anti-tank guns and self-propelled batteries from sectors where German resistance was weakening to those where counterattacks were expected, creating mobile fire groups that could reinforce threatened points along the axis leading toward Vileyka. Adaptation was equally visible in logistics. Supply officers reorganized routes to exploit captured German depots and fuel stocks, reducing reliance on long east-west convoys over damaged roads. Captured trucks and horse teams were pressed into service, often driven by hastily assigned Soviet personnel who had only basic familiarity with the vehicles. Engineer units repaired bridges in ways that differed from peacetime regulations, accepting temporary structures with lower safety margins in order to keep traffic flowing. When road craters or destroyed culverts blocked heavier transport, ammunition and food were moved forward by relay systems, using carts or even hand-carried loads between improvised dumps. Tactically, Soviet formations modified their approach to German resistance that had shifted from continuous trench lines to isolated strongpoints. Instead of frontal assaults by entire battalions, commanders increasingly used reconnaissance groups, sappers, and small assault detachments to probe weak spots and identify gaps between localities. Artillery preparation was adjusted to shorter, more concentrated missions aimed at single villages or crossroads, followed immediately by infantry attacks before surviving defenders could reorganize. Where German units formed hedgehog positions, surrounded but still firing, Soviet troops often bypassed them to continue advancing toward operational objectives, leaving smaller forces and, in some cases, partisans to contain or reduce the pockets later. German resistance and adaptation took place under more restrictive conditions. 3rd Panzer Army and Corps headquarters attempted to stabilize the situation by grouping remnants of several units into Kampfgruppen under experienced officers, combining infantry, a few assault guns, and available artillery. These ad hoc formations were tasked with holding key terrain, such as road junctions or river crossings, long enough to allow other troops to withdraw. Defensive tactics shifted toward flexible delaying actions. Rather than attempting to restore an unbroken line, units conducted short local counterattacks to disorganize Soviet pursuit, then pulled back to the next available defensible position. To compensate for shortages of heavy weapons, German commanders increased reliance on mines, demolitions, and terrain. Engineer detachments prepared charges on bridges and in culverts along routes leading toward Lepel and Vileyka, detonating them as Soviet vanguards approached. In forested areas, trees were felled across roads to slow traffic and expose column heads to fire from concealed positions. Where time permitted, shallow entrenchments and foxholes were dug on reverse slopes, making Soviet observation and artillery correction more difficult. These measures could not reverse the overall situation, but contributed to delaying Soviet units and imposing additional attrition. Partisan formations played a distinct role in this phase of resistance and adaptation. In areas already passed by the main Soviet forces, partisans took over responsibilities for local security, clearing mines, guarding bridges, and detaining remaining German stragglers. Ahead of the advancing front, they intensified attacks on German communication lines, cutting telephone cables, ambushing small convoys, and reporting on the movement of columns retreating toward Molodechno. Their knowledge of local paths and terrain allowed them to guide Soviet reconnaissance groups through forest tracks that bypassed prepared demolitions on main roads, shortening the time needed to resume movement after encountering obstacles. The psychological dimension of this phase affected all participants. Soviet soldiers advancing through areas previously held for years by German forces encountered evidence of occupation policies and partisan warfare, which political officers integrated into their explanations of the campaign's significance. At the same time, fatigue accumulated. Long marches, repeated engagements, and limited opportunities for rest produced a growing dependence on unit cohesion and command authority to maintain discipline. German soldiers, confronted with the visible loss of positions, long described as decisive for the defense of the Eastern Territories, experienced uncertainty about higher command decisions and about the prospects of establishing new defensive lines farther west. Civilian behavior also adapted to the changing military situation. In villages and towns that passed under Soviet control, residents began to reconstitute local administrations, sometimes under the guidance of cadres sent forward by Soviet civil authorities. Food stocks, livestock, and tools that had been hidden during the final weeks of German control were brought out to support both households and military units. In areas still crossed by German columns, civilians made individual choices between staying, evacuating with retreating forces, or entering the forests to join relatives in partisan detachments. These decisions were influenced by previous experiences under both German occupation and partisan activity, as well as by expectations about the consequences of the front's final passage. Information flows shaped how resistance and adaptation were perceived. Soviet reports emphasized the coordinated actions of regular forces and partisans in disrupting German communications, while German communiques referred to withdrawals to shorter or more favorable lines rather than to a continuous retreat. On maps in headquarters, the reality was clearer. Arrows indicating Soviet advances and German withdrawals converged on the same limited set of road and rail nodes. The decisions taken in this phase, how long to hold particular points, where to commit scarce reserves, and how to use irregular forces, determined not only the pace of the Soviet approach toward Vileyka and Molodechno, but also the condition of the German formations that would later be involved in the attempts to defend Minsk and its escape routes. The turning point on the Vileyka axis emerged when the breach on the northern wing ceased to be a local event and became the main avenue for deep encirclement. Around 26th June, 3rd Belarusian Front issued orders that formalized what the battlefield already suggested. The left wing, built on 39th and 5th Armies, would no longer be treated as a supporting effort, but as one of the principal directions for advancing toward the interior of Army Group Center. Operational instructions emphasized rapid movement west and southwest, explicitly mentioning the rail lines running through Lapel and Molodechno as priority targets rather than distant objectives. For Soviet commanders at Army and Corps level, the crucial decision was to keep pushing, despite growing gaps between forward units and their rear services. Instead of pausing to straighten the line, 39th Army sent its most mobile rifle divisions and attached tank units ahead, accepting the risk that their flanks would be covered only by thinner screens. 5th Army, feeding formations into the corridor behind them, received orders to secure the shoulders of the penetration and to prepare crossings on routes that would eventually point toward Vileyka. The designation of specific mechanized and cavalry formations for exploitation toward the Molodechno area confirmed that the Axis was no longer ancillary. It was now central to how the encirclement east of Minsk would be closed. On the German side, the same days produced a different kind of turning point. Decisions taken at Army Group Center and 3rd Panzer Army headquarters acknowledged that the original forward defensive concept had failed. Orders were issued for withdrawals toward lines closer to the Berezina and toward positions covering Minsk from the north. However, the timing of these directives and the insistence on holding certain localities as long as possible meant that some divisions received permission to retreat only after Soviet spearheads were already moving through their rear areas. Attempts to organize a controlled, stepwise withdrawal along prepared intermediate lines instead turned into fragmented movements, with battalions and regiments retreating along roads that were under air attack or already threatened by Soviet advance guards. The impact of these decisions became visible on the map and on the ground. Soviet units advancing along forest roads west of the initial front line began to intersect German columns moving in the same direction, but hours later. In some cases, Soviet reconnaissance groups reported sighting German transport abandoned on verges, its loads burned or scattered after airstrikes. In others, hastily organized German battle groups tried to hold villages that lay at the junction of several roads, knowing that their loss would open direct routes toward the rail network feeding Molodechno. Where these local stands succeeded, they delayed Soviet progress by hours or a day. Where they failed, the result was often the capture of intact or lightly damaged infrastructure that immediately became part of the Soviet logistical grid. For the soldiers involved, the turning point was felt less as a single decision and more as a change in the character of movement. Soviet infantry, who had spent the first days of the operation fighting for each trench and strongpoint, now found themselves advancing over longer distances between organized resistance, encountering scattered groups of German soldiers, destroyed vehicles, and occasional ambushes rather than continuous lines. German troops, conversely, experienced a shift from defending fixed positions to conducting marches under pressure, where danger came from artillery falling on assembly areas, from aircraft attacking columns, and from Soviet units appearing along side roads previously considered safe. Civilians perceived the change in similarly practical terms. In areas east of Liepel and along routes leading toward Vileyka, the pace of German evacuation increased, but the presence of organized administration diminished. Local offices closed without formal handover, and military traffic dominated the roads. When Soviet units arrived, often preceded by partisans, they did so in the context of a front that had moved dozens of kilometers in a few days, rather than through a slow, methodical approach. This altered the pattern of requisitions, billeting, and security measures, as new authorities tried to establish control over territories that had shifted hands in rapid succession. The role of partisans at this turning point underlined the interaction between regular and irregular forces. As German command tried to move units and supplies along remaining usable lines, partisan attacks gained disproportionate weight. Demolished culverts, mined crossroads, and destroyed telephone lines multiplied the effects of Soviet deep operations. Reports from German rear services described frequent interruptions to traffic and difficulties in transmitting orders. For Soviet headquarters, these same disruptions were evidence that the planned cooperation with partisan formations was now achieving its intended operational effect, further justifying the decision to treat the Vileyka axis as a main direction. In strategic terms, the turning point on this lesser-known sector was defined by convergence. The northern wedge of 3rd Belarusian Front began to align with advances made by neighbouring Soviet formations, threatening to cut the links between Army Group Center and German forces further north. At the same time, the the deepening penetration pointed directly toward the rail and road network that would be needed for any organized German withdrawal from Minsk. From this moment, the question was no longer whether the line east of Minsk would break, but how far west German troops would be able to retreat before the corridors through nodes such as Vileyka and Molodechno were compromised or cut entirely. The immediate aftermath of the breakthrough on the Vileyka axis unfolded in rapid withdrawals and fragmented rearguard actions. From late June into early July 1944, German divisions on the northern part of Army Group Center attempted to disengage from collapsing positions east of the Berezina and move toward new defensive lines closer to Minsk and further back toward the Baltic and East Prussia. Units that had been designated to hold sectors near Vitebsk now had to retreat across terrain already infiltrated by Soviet spearheads from 39th and 5th Armies, while other formations tried to move along roads leading toward Lepel, Vileyka and Molodechno that were increasingly under Soviet artillery and air observation. For Soviet forces, the end of the intensive fighting phase around 23rd to 26th June did not mean a halt, but a transition from breaking a front to closing encirclements and pursuing retreating enemy units. Elements of 39th Army pushed west and southwest, linking with formations advancing from the Vitebsk and Orsha directions. 5th Army, following through the corridor opened by the earlier offensive, secured captured crossings and road junctions, and turned its attention to cutting routes that might still allow German units to escape toward the northwest. Forward detachments were sent ahead of the main bodies to seize bridges, railway stations, and small towns that connected the Vileyka and Molodechno areas with Minsk and with German-held territory to the west. The German withdrawals lacked the characteristics of an orderly, phased retreat. Columns composed of infantry remnants, artillery batteries, supply units, and administrative personnel moved simultaneously, often without clear priority. On some routes, combat units had to wait, while logistical trains attempted to pass, creating bottlenecks that were vulnerable to Soviet air attacks and partisan ambushes. In other places, rear services found roads blocked by troops moving in the opposite direction, trying to rejoin their parent formations or to reach crossing points before they were cut off. The result was a pattern of partial encirclements and localized surrenders, particularly where Soviet forces advancing from the Vileyka sector intersected with routes leading out of the Minsk area. By the end of the first week of July, these movements converged in the wider encirclement east of Minsk. German units that had held the line between Vitebsk and Lepel found themselves pushed into pockets where their remaining options were either to attempt breakout along paths already disrupted by Soviet advances from the north and northeast, or to surrender. Soviet reports recorded large numbers of prisoners taken in wooded areas and on secondary roads, including personnel from divisions that had been reduced to small fractions of their original strength. For the Third Belarusian Front, the contribution of the Northern Wing was measured less in the number of cities directly captured during the first days than in the role it played in closing the ring around Army Group Center's central formations. The end of combat operations in the Vileyka sector also had immediate consequences for civilians. As the front passed and stabilized further west, local populations faced the task of reconstructing daily life in areas that had experienced both prolonged occupation and intense fighting. Villages near former front lines contained destroyed houses, unexploded ordnance, and minefields left by both retreating German troops and advancing Soviet units. Agricultural work resumed under difficult conditions. Many draft animals had been requisitioned or killed, fields were damaged by shelling or vehicle tracks, and labour was reduced by wartime losses and deportations. Soviet authorities began organising local Soviets, police, and economic committees, while also conducting screenings to identify collaborators and to integrate former partisan fighters into regular structures. German soldiers and civilians who had retreated through the Vileyka and Molodechno corridors carried their own set of immediate consequences. Units that escaped the encirclement east of Minsk in fragmented form arrived in the rear, with depleted ranks and reduced equipment, affecting their ability to form effective defensive lines further west. Refugees and evacuees who succeeded in moving beyond the area found themselves in territories that would soon come under pressure from subsequent Soviet offensives. For many, the withdrawal through this sector represented one stage in a longer sequence of displacements that would continue as the front advanced toward the borders of the pre-war Reich. Humanitarian issues were present, but handled differently by the respective authorities. Soviet medical services treated not only their own wounded, but also some local civilians injured during the fighting, though resources were unevenly distributed and prioritized for military needs. Reconstruction campaigns focused first on restoring transportation infrastructure, roads, bridges, and railways that would support further operations before addressing housing and public services. German medical and welfare structures in the retreat zones were limited by the speed of the withdrawal and by the loss of supplies, leaving many wounded soldiers dependent on field treatment or on capture by advancing Soviet forces. The formal end of large-scale fighting in the Vileyka offensive zone did not mean an abrupt cessation of violence. Isolated German groups attempted to move west on their own, sometimes engaging in brief skirmishes with Soviet patrols or partisan units. Mine incidents, accidental explosions, and encounters with unexploded ammunition continued to cause casualties among soldiers and civilians. At the same time, partisan detachments shifted from a focus on sabotage and ambushes to roles in local security, disarmament of stragglers, and support for the re-establishment of Soviet administration. In the immediate military calculus, the aftermath of the Vileyka offensive was reflected in new front lines and in the condition of the forces holding them. Soviet formations on the northern wing of 3rd Belarusian Front emerged from the operation with combat experience and territorial gains, but also with significant attrition in personnel and materiel, requiring replenishment before the next major advance. German formations that had been engaged in this sector reappeared, often in reduced form, in the order of battle for subsequent attempts to defend central Poland and the approaches to East Prussia. The Vileyka corridor, through which these opposing trajectories crossed, had thus functioned as both a battlefield and a transit zone, shaping the immediate post-battle landscape on both sides of the front. In the longer view of 1944, the Vileyka offensive became a component of a much larger transformation on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration as a whole resulted in the destruction or severe degradation of more than 25 German divisions in Army Group Center, with total German casualties in the central sector estimated in contemporary and later studies at between 350,000 and 400,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Within that total, the contribution of the 3rd Belarusian Front's northern wing cannot be separated neatly by numbers, but its advance toward Lepel, Vileyka, and Molodechno formed one of the corridors that made large-scale encirclement east of Minsk possible. Strategically, the breakthrough on this axis helped to dislocate the entire German defensive system in Belarus and the Baltic approaches. By forcing 3rd Panzer Army to retreat under pressure, and by threatening the rail junction at Molodechno, the operation reduced the options for withdrawing organized forces toward Vilnius and Kaunas. It also weakened the connection between Army Group Center and Army Group North, contributing to later difficulties in stabilizing a continuous line along the Niemen and in the Baltic states. The resulting gaps affected German planning for the remainder of 1944, including decisions about where to allocate new formations transferred from the west after the Normandy landings. For the Soviet side, the Vileyka advance demonstrated the effectiveness of combined deep operations at a scale that earlier campaigns had only partially achieved. The coordination of rifle armies, mechanized and cavalry formations, air support and partisan activity produced results consistent with pre-war doctrines about breaking through and exploiting in depth. At the same time, the operation exposed limitations, logistical strain, difficulties in maintaining communications, and the risk of overextension. These experiences informed subsequent operations, such as the advance into Lithuania and toward East Prussia, where planners again had to balance speed of movement against the need to secure flanks and supply routes. Politically and socially, the liberation of the territories around Vileyka and Molodechno formed part of the broader re-establishment of Soviet authority in Belarus. The reassertion of central control, the reconstruction of local administrations, and the integration of partisan structures into state institutions all unfolded in areas that had just experienced rapid front movement. The local memory of the offensive blended with memories of occupation, anti-partisan operations, and earlier phases of the war, shaping post-war narratives at village, district, and republican levels. These narratives coexisted with Central Soviet representations of Bagration, which highlighted major cities and named operations rather than individual corridors like the Vileyka axis. In German post-war accounts, the emphasis often fell on the sudden collapse of Army Group Center as a whole, on the loss of Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, and on the encirclement at Minsk. Memoirs and operational studies tended to describe the northern breakthroughs in terms of lost positions and overrun divisions, without always distinguishing the specific role of the advance toward Vileyka and Molodechno. When this sector appeared, it was frequently as part of broader descriptions of retreat routes, rearguard actions, or the difficulty of establishing new lines behind the Berezina and Niemen. Historiography in different countries reflected these choices of focus. Soviet and later Russian works on Operation Bagration devoted more space to named battles and large encirclements than to the detailed chronology of the Vileyka sector, although operational maps showed the advance of 39th and 5th Armies. Western studies that sought to summarize the campaign for general audiences similarly concentrated on Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobruisk, and Minsk, often mentioning the northern wedge only briefly as one of several breakthroughs. Specialist research on the German 3rd Panzer Army or on partisan warfare in Belarus provided more detail, but such studies reached narrower circles. From a military analytical perspective, the Vileyka offensive illustrates how operations that are not the most visible in public memory can nonetheless be essential to outcomes. The depth and timing of the penetration on this axis influenced how quickly German forces could be enveloped, how many units escaped encirclement, and where subsequent defensive lines could be formed. The fact that the main encirclement east of Minsk could be closed within a little more than a week after the start of Bagration depended not only on frontal attacks against fixed positions, but also on the success of advances like the one conducted by 39th and 5th Armies. For the people who experienced it directly, the legacy was measured less in operational categories than in long-term effects on local life. The destruction of infrastructure, the loss of population through wartime deaths and deportations, and the reconfiguration of land use and settlement patterns all left traces that extended far beyond 1944. Post-war reconstruction policies, including the rebuilding of railways through Molodechno and the promotion of new industrial and agricultural projects in the region, were influenced by the wartime significance of these communication nodes and by the need to integrate them fully into the Soviet economic space. In memory and commemoration, the Vileyka sector occupies an intermediate position. Monuments, plaques, and mass graves in the region record the presence of Soviet units, partisans, and civilians killed during the fighting and the occupation. At the same time, broader public representations of Operation Bagration continue to foreground the more widely known battles. This distribution of attention reveals how historical significance is constructed. Operations that are essential in a structural sense may remain less prominent in collective narratives if they lack a single easily named battle, or if they are overshadowed by events with clearer symbolic markers. Viewed in this way, The Vileyka offensive can be understood as a case study in the relationship between local operations and global outcomes. Its success did not by itself determine the collapse of Army Group Center, but it shaped the geometry of that collapse and the speed at which it occurred. It illustrates how advances along what appear to be secondary axes can become decisive when they intersect with communication networks, political objectives, and parallel offensives. As part of Operation Bagration, the Vileyka axis demonstrates that the less visible segments of a campaign can play a critical role in the overall pattern of a war, even if they remain comparatively less present in later public memory.